I always told people that numbers don't lie, but that Tuesday night when I saw my wife's tablet light up with a message she never intended for me to see, I realized that numbers were about to become my weapon of mass destruction. The notification vanished in seconds, but my brain, trained by 15 years of finding financial holes that CEOs tried to hide, had already captured the anomaly. And what I saw in those few words wasn't just infidelity, but industrial espionage wrapped in lipstick and perfume. Within 72 hours, I would transform from a faithful husband into a predator hunting two targets simultaneously, and the bloodbath I was planning would make Wall Street's worst crashes look like a minor accounting error. I sat in my home office that evening, surrounded by three monitors displaying the usual cascade of data from the acquisition I was managing. But my mind had already shifted into what I called hunter mode. Jessica had left her tablet on the couch when she went to take her nightly bath, one of those long soaks where she claimed she needed to decompress from the stress of her marketing director position. The message I glimpsed wasn't from a girlfriend discussing brunch plans or a colleague asking about campaign metrics. It was from someone named Derek, and the preview line contained confidential details about the Northbridge merger I'd been working on for 6 months. Information that should have been locked in my encrypted files in my head. My pulse didn't spike with jealousy or heartbreak. Instead, I felt that cold clarity that comes when you're analyzing a balance sheet and suddenly you spot the embezzlement pattern hiding in plain sight. I didn't storm into the bathroom demanding explanations or throw her belongings onto the street like some television drama protagonist. That kind of emotional outburst is for amateurs who want temporary satisfaction instead of permanent victory. I'm a crisis manager, a financial liquidator, the person corporations call when they need someone to dismantle a failing division without leaving evidence or loose ends. My specialty is finding the cancer in a company's body and cutting it out so cleanly that the patient doesn't even realize they were sick until they see the pathology report. So I did what I do best. I became invisible. I became methodical. I became ruthless. The next morning, I kissed Jessica goodbye, just like I had every workday for the past 8 years, watched her apply that expensive lipstick she loved, and told her I'd probably work late on the Northbridge files. She smiled that smile I'd once found enchanting, the one that crinkled the corners of her eyes, and said she understood because she also had a long day ahead with client presentations. I noticed she was wearing the black dress I'd bought her for our anniversary last year, the one that hugged her figure in ways that made heads turn, and I wondered if Derek appreciated how I'd funded his mistress's wardrobe. The thought should have made me angry, but instead I felt nothing except that familiar analytical detachment. She was already a closed account in my mind, a bad investment that needed to be written off, and I was simply documenting the losses before filing the paperwork. My first stop wasn't a lawyer's office or a private investigator's agency. I went straight to my firm's IT department, where I had a long conversation with Marcus, our digital forensics specialist who I'd saved from a nasty insider trading investigation 3 years ago. People think loyalty can't be bought, but that's naive. Loyalty is just debt by another name, and Marcus owed me everything. Within 2 hours, I had full access to Jessica's cloud storage, her email accounts, her social media messages, and most importantly, her location data from the GPS tracker in her luxury SUV that I'd been paying for since she graduated from her modest sedan 4 years ago. I didn't need Marcus to interpret the data. I'm perfectly capable of reading a map that showed my wife's car spending 3 afternoons a week at the Meridian Hotel downtown, while her calendar claimed she was at client meetings across the city. The financial records told an even better story. Jessica's credit card statements revealed a pattern of charges at high-end restaurants, boutiques, and jewelry stores. But here's where it got interesting. She wasn't paying for these luxuries herself. The transactions were being reimbursed by a corporate card belonging to Vance Industries, a mid-tier manufacturing company that had been trying to compete with my clients for government contracts. I pulled up their corporate structure, ran a few searches through public records databases, and felt my lips curl into something that might have resembled a smile if it had contained any warmth whatsoever. Derek Vance was listed as CEO, one of those executive types who appeared on magazine covers talking about innovations and leadership while contributing absolutely nothing of value to actual business operations. But the real revelation came when I dug deeper into Vance Industries' ownership structure. Derek Vance might have had the title in the corner office, but he owned exactly 0% of the company's equity. The controlling interest, 92% of voting shares, belonged to his wife, Victoria Vance, who served as chairman of the board and whose signature appeared on every major contract and financial filing. Derek was a facade, a pretty puppet who played CEO, while his wife's inherited fortune bankrolled his lifestyle and his company. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a complete ecosystem of deception where my wife was stealing my intellectual property to feed her lover, who was using his wife's money to fund their affair, which meant that somewhere in this mess was a woman who had even more reason to want revenge than I did. I spent the next 48 hours living a strange double life that would have destroyed a lesser man's sanity. During the day, I was the perfect professional, conducting conference calls, reviewing acquisition terms, and negotiating with attorneys about due diligence procedures. During the evenings, I played the role of the slightly distracted but still devoted husband, asking Jessica about her day, listening to her fabricated stories about difficult clients and demanding campaigns, and watching her check her phone every 15 minutes like an addict needing a fix. At night, after she fell asleep, I worked on my real project, which was building a case file so comprehensive that it would make a prosecutor weep with joy. The evidence I compiled wasn't just about hurt feelings or violated marriage vows. This was corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, and potentially securities fraud if Derek was using my stolen information to manipulate stock prices or secure contracts through insider knowledge. Every email Jessica sent to Derek containing details about my client's merger strategies, every document she photographed with, her phone from my home office, every late-night conversation where she fed him information about competitive bids, it all went into my growing digital archive. I organized it chronologically, cross-referenced it with market movements and contract awards, and calculated the financial damages in hard numbers that would make a jury's eyes water. By the end of the week, I had enough material to send both of them to federal prison for 5 to 10 years. But prison seemed too easy, too impersonal, too removed from the immediate satisfaction I craved. What I needed was a partner, someone with the resources and motivation to help me orchestrate something more elegant than a simple criminal prosecution. I needed Victoria Vance, and based on what I'd learned about her from public records and business profiles, I suspected she would be very interested in my proposal. Victoria came from old manufacturing money, the kind of family that built their fortune making steel and engines during the industrial boom. She'd inherited Vance Industries from her father at 35 after he died of a heart attack, and instead of selling to a conglomerate like everyone expected, she'd restructured the company, cut the dead weight, and turned it into a lean, profitable operation. Then she'd married Derek, a charming sales executive from a competitor, and made the mistake of trusting him with a public-facing role while she focused on strategy and finance. I requested a meeting through her executive assistant, identifying myself as a crisis management consultant with information about financial irregularities at her company. I didn't use email or phone calls that could be traced or recorded. I sent a courier with a sealed envelope containing a single page, no names, just 3 columns of numbers, showing money flowing out of Vance Industries accounts into shell companies what I'd traced back to Jessica's name. At the bottom of the page, I wrote a single line: 30% is missing. I know where it went. The St. Regis Club, Thursday, 8 p.m. I didn't sign it, didn't include contact information, didn't explain anything. Either she'd be curious enough to show up or she wouldn't. But I was betting that a woman who'd built her reputation on financial discipline wouldn't ignore evidence of systematic theft. Thursday evening arrived with that peculiar clarity that comes before a storm. I dressed in my best suit, the charcoal brioni that I reserve for board meetings and high-stakes negotiations, and told Jessica I had a business dinner with a potential client. She barely looked up from her phone, probably texting Derek about their next hotel rendezvous, and waved me off with an absent gesture. The St. Regis Club occupied the top floor of a building in Midtown, one of those exclusive establishments where membership costs more than most people's annual salary, and where conversations happened in soundproof booths designed for discretion. I arrived 15 minutes early, ordered a 25-year-old scotch, and waited. Victoria Vance walked in at exactly 8 p.m., and I recognized her immediately from the photos I'd studied, but pictures don't capture presence. And this woman had the kind of energy that made people instinctively step aside. She was tall, maybe 5'10", with dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested efficiency rather than fashion, and she wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Jessica's entire wardrobe. Her eyes scanned the room with the methodical assessment of someone who always calculated the angles. And when she spotted me in the corner booth, I saw no hesitation, no uncertainty, just the purposeful stride of someone who decided this meeting was worth her time. She sat down across from me without offering a handshake or small talk, placed a slim black portfolio on the table and waited. I appreciated the professionalism. This wasn't going to be an emotional conversation about betrayed spouses seeking comfort or validation. This was going to be a business negotiation between two people who understood that revenge, when done properly, is just another form of strategic planning. I slid a folder across the table, thicker than the single page I'd sent her, and watched her face as she opened it and began reading. I'd organized the contents like a financial prospectus, complete with executive summary, detailed findings, supporting documentation, and recommended actions. The first section documented Derek's systematic embezzlement, showing how he'd established 3 shell companies under Jessica's name and social security number, funneling money from Vance Industries' procurement budgets through fake vendor contracts. The amount started small 3 years ago, maybe $50,000 here, $20,000 there, but they'd grown exponentially as he gained confidence. And in the past 6 months alone, he'd stolen over $2 million. The second section detailed the affair itself, not with sordid photos or emotional appeals, but with receipts, hotel invoices, and credit card statements that showed a pattern of company resources being used for personal entertainment. The third section, and this was my favorite, outlined how Derek was using information stolen from my clients to undercut bids and secure contracts that Vance Industries shouldn't have been able to win. I watched Victoria's expression as she read, and if she felt any emotional reaction to learning that her husband was sleeping with another man's wife while robbing her company blind, she didn't show it. Her face remained professionally neutral, but I noticed her jaw tighten slightly when she reached the page showing that Derek had used her corporate card to buy Jessica a diamond bracelet worth $35,000. She closed the folder, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at me with eyes that probably made weak executives confess to budget overruns and missed deadlines. When she finally spoke, her voice had the temperature of liquid nitrogen. She asked me what I wanted, cutting straight through any pretense that this was about morality or justice or wounded pride. I told her the truth. I wanted total destruction of both targets, public humiliation that would make them unemployable in any professional capacity, and financial devastation that would take them decades to recover from if they ever did. I wanted Derek stripped of his title, his reputation, and his access to her money. I wanted Jessica to lose everything I'd helped her build, every contact I'd introduced her to, every opportunity I'd created through my network. Most importantly, I wanted them to understand that they hadn't just betrayed their spouses. They'd made the fatal mistake of betraying partners who were smarter, richer, and infinitely more dangerous than they'd realized. Victoria listened to my proposal without interruption, and when I finished it, she pulled out her own folder from the portfolio. It contained divorce papers already prepared, asset protection documents transferring her personal wealth into trusts that Derek couldn't touch, and a criminal complaint drafted by her attorneys detailing the embezzlement with enough evidence to trigger a federal investigation. She'd known something was wrong, had apparently been conducting her own audit for weeks, but she hadn't had the full picture until I provided the connection between Derek's theft and his affair with Jessica. She told me she'd been planning a quiet divorce with a generous settlement to avoid public scandal, but now that she understood the scope of his betrayal and his connection to corporate espionage, she was willing to pursue something more aggressive. We spent the next 2 hours planning what could only be described as a coordinated demolition project. Victoria wanted to expose Derek at the company's annual gala, a black-tie charity event that drew media coverage and industry leaders, where he was scheduled to announce record profits and unveil an expansion plan. I pointed out that Jessica would likely attend as his guest, claiming it was a networking opportunity for her marketing career, which meant we could handle both targets simultaneously in front of an audience that included their professional peers, potential clients, and business journalists. The publicity would be devastating and permanent. Victoria made a phone call to her head of security, instructing him to have a comprehensive audit ready to present at the gala, complete with visual aids and documentation that could be distributed to attendees and media. I contributed my own resources, including forensic accountants from my firm who could verify the numbers and testify if needed, attorneys who specialized in corporate fraud cases, and my connections with several business journalists who would be very interested in a story about a CEO stealing from his own company to fund an affair with a corporate spy. We divided responsibilities like generals planning a military campaign, identifying potential obstacles, preparing contingency responses, and ensuring that every detail was documented and verifiable. This wasn't going to be an emotional confrontation that people could dismiss as a domestic dispute. This was going to be a public execution with receipts, witnesses, and irrefutable evidence. Before we parted that night, Victoria asked me one question that I respected her for asking. She wanted to know if I felt guilty about destroying Jessica's life, if I had any reservations about humiliating her in front of hundreds of people, if I worried that I was being too harsh or vindictive. I answered honestly. I told her that Jessica made her choices knowing exactly what she was risking, that she'd actively participated in criminal activity by stealing confidential information, and that she'd shown no remorse or hesitation while spending my money to fund her affair with a man who was robbing his own wife. Guilt is what you feel when you've done something wrong. I felt nothing except satisfaction that I was about to balance a very unbalanced equation. The next 2 weeks felt like the calm before a hurricane that you know is coming but can't quite predict. I continued my normal routine, working on the Northbridge acquisition, attending client meetings, and maintaining the fiction of a stable marriage. Jessica remained completely oblivious to the storm gathering around her, still texting Derek constantly, still lying about her afternoon appointments, still wearing the expensive clothes and jewelry that I now knew had been purchased with stolen money. There was a surreal quality to these days, like watching a play where I knew the ending, but the other actors were still improvising their way toward inevitable tragedy. I used that time to quietly liquidate joint assets and protect my financial interests. I transferred money from shared accounts into trusts and retirement funds that Jessica couldn't touch in a divorce. I sold the vacation property in the Hamptons that was technically in my name, but that we treated as marital property. I shifted investments out of anything Jessica had signing authority over. I even canceled the lease on her luxury SUV and arranged for it to be repossessed the day after the gala. By the time I was done, the financial landscape of our marriage had been completely restructured, with everything of value locked behind legal walls that would take years and hundreds of thousands in attorney fees to breach. I was building a desert where Jessica would find herself stranded with nothing except the consequences of her choices. Victoria was conducting her own preparations at Vance Industries, quietly replacing key personnel loyal to Derek with her own people, restructuring the company's financial controls to require her signature on any transaction over $10,000, and conducting discreet interviews with board members to ensure their support when she made her move. She also hired a private investigation firm to document Derek's movements, creating a timeline that corroborated everything I'd found and adding even more detail about his activities. The investigators discovered that Derek had been running this same scheme at his previous job before marrying Victoria, stealing from that company to fund a different affair, which ended when he was forced to resign quietly after being caught. Victoria's father had done the due diligence before agreeing to the marriage, but Derek had managed to bury that history, and her father had been too charmed by Derek's sales skills to dig deeper. The discovery of Derek's pattern of behavior seemed to harden Victoria's resolve even further. This wasn't just about one instance of betrayal, but about a man who saw marriage as an opportunity for exploitation and companies as personal piggy banks. She told me during one of our planning sessions that she felt foolish for not seeing it earlier, for being so focused on running the business that she'd ignored the warning signs in her personal life. I told her that predators are good at what they do because they know how to identify and exploit blind spots, and that the appropriate response wasn't guilt, but corrective action. We were both taking corrective action, and it was going to be spectacular. The week before the gala, Jessica mentioned casually over dinner that she'd been invited to the Vance Industries event through a marketing contact and asked if I minded if she attended, since it could be good networking for her career. I pretended to consider it, asked her a few questions about who would be there and what the event format was, and then told her it sounded like a great opportunity and she should definitely go. She seemed almost disappointed that I wasn't jealous or suspicious, probably hoping for some drama to make her feel more justified in her affair. But I just smiled and suggested she buy a new dress for the occasion. I even gave her my credit card, knowing it would be the last purchase she'd ever make on my account, and wanting her to be dressed perfectly for her own public execution. The night of the gala arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, and temperatures cool enough to be comfortable in formal wear. I spent the day in my office reviewing the final presentation materials Victoria and I had prepared, confirming that all the journalists we'd tipped off would be attending, and ensuring that our attorneys were ready to file the criminal complaints and divorce papers the moment we gave the signal. Everything was choreographed down to the minute, every contingency planned for, every loose end tied off. This was my kind of operation, where preparation and precision matter more than emotion or improvisation. At 6 p.m., I went home to the empty apartment since Jessica had left early to get ready at a salon, and I showered, shaved, and dressed in my best tuxedo. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone who looked calm, composed, and completely in control, which was accurate. Some part of me wondered if I should feel nervous or guilty or conflicted, but those emotions seemed to belong to a different person, someone who still believed in forgiveness and second chances and working things out. That person died the moment I saw Jessica's tablet light up with stolen confidential information. The person standing in the mirror now was someone who understood that certain betrayals don't deserve mercy. They deserve mathematical precision in their punishment. The black limousine Victoria sent arrived at 7 p.m., and I climbed into the back seat to find her already there, dressed in a stunning black evening gown that somehow managed to look both elegant and threatening. We didn't speak during the drive to the Plaza Hotel, where the gala was being held in their grand ballroom, but the silence was comfortable, the kind of quiet that exists between partners who trust each other's competence. I reviewed the documents one more time while she checked her phone, responding to last-minute messages from her team. As we pulled up to the red carpet entrance, where photographers and media were already gathering, I felt that familiar pre-negotiation adrenaline, the chemical rush that comes right before you walk into a boardroom to deliver news that's going to change everyone's life. We stepped out of the limousine together, and I offered Victoria my arm in a gesture that was both chivalrous and strategic. The camera started flashing immediately, and I could hear confused murmurs from the reporters who recognized both of us, but couldn't figure out why we were arriving together. Victoria Vance and Grant Stone weren't supposed to be allies. Our companies competed for contracts. Our professional circles overlapped but didn't merge, and there was no reason for us to be attending this event as a couple. The confusion was perfect. It would make everyone pay attention, make them wonder what was happening, and ensure that every eye in that ballroom would be watching when we made our move. We walked through the hotel lobby and into the grand ballroom, where the gala was already in full swing. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables draped in white linen, waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and the cream of New York's business society mingled in clusters, making deals and connections while pretending to care about the charity being supported. I scanned the room methodically, looking for my targets, and found them near the stage where Derek was supposed to give his address later in the evening. He was holding court with a group of investors, playing the role of successful CEO, gesturing expansively while people laughed at his jokes. Jessica stood beside him wearing the red dress she'd bought with my credit card, looking radiant and confident, completely unaware that she was about to become the cautionary tale people would reference for years. The moment they noticed us, I watched their faces transform in slow motion, and it was one of the most satisfying things I'd ever witnessed. Derek's expression went from self-satisfied pride to confusion to recognition to absolute horror in the space of about 3 seconds. His champagne glass actually slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that made people nearby turn to look. Jessica's reaction was even better. Her eyes met mine across the room, and I saw the exact moment when her brain made the connection, when she realized that Victoria Vance, Derek's wife, the woman whose company and money he'd been stealing from to fund their affair, was standing next to me, Grant Stone, Jessica's husband, who she'd been stealing from and lying to for who knows how long. The color drained from her face so completely that for a second, I thought she might actually faint. Derek recovered first, probably because he'd had more practice lying and performing, and started moving toward us with a fake smile plastered on his face like he was going to bluff his way through this somehow. I had to admire the audacity even as I prepared to demolish it. He reached us just as Victoria signaled to her head of security, a former FBI agent named Marcus, who looked like he could bench press a truck, and the room's energy shifted as people sensed something unusual was happening. Derek opened his mouth to say something, probably some nonsense about what a surprise it was to see us here, but Victoria cut him off with a gesture that was somehow both casual and absolutely devastating in its dismissiveness. She informed him in a voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear that his services as CEO were no longer required and that security would be escorting him from the premises immediately. Derek's fake smile crumbled, and he tried to laugh it off, asking if this was some kind of joke, But Victoria's expression could have frozen nitrogen. She told him it wasn't a joke, it was a termination for cause, and that he would be receiving official notification along with criminal referrals to federal prosecutors in the morning. The conversations around us had stopped completely now. People were staring, and I could see Derek's face turning red as he realized this wasn't a private humiliation but a public execution. He made the mistake of trying to appeal to his wife's emotions, saying they needed to talk about this privately, that there must be some misunderstanding, that they could work this out. Victoria simply looked at him with the kind of cold assessment you might give a malfunctioning piece of equipment before shutting it down, and told him that the misunderstanding was his belief that he was irreplaceable or valuable. She explained that she'd already installed a new interim CEO, that the board had been briefed and approved her decision unanimously, and that his personal belongings from the office were being boxed up as they spoke. Derek's eyes were wild now, darting around looking for support or sympathy, but everyone was just watching like this was dinner theater included with their ticket price. That's when Jessica made her fatal error in judgment. She rushed over, probably thinking she could de-escalate the situation or protect Derek, and grabbed his arm while glaring at me like I was the villain in this scenario. She actually had the nerve to say that I was being cruel and vindictive, that I should be ashamed of myself for ruining what was supposed to be a lovely evening, that Derek and Victoria's marriage problems had nothing to do with me, and I should mind my own business. The absolute audacity of that statement, coming from a woman who'd spent months stealing my confidential information and sleeping with another woman's husband, was so stunning that I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened the presentation file I'd prepared, and handed it to one of the event staff with instructions to put it on the main screen that had been showing charity promotional videos. Within seconds, the romantic montage of children being helped by the charity was replaced by a different kind of story, one told in bank statements, hotel receipts, text messages, and financial transfers. The title slide read, "A Case Study in Corporate Theft and Infidelity, How Derek Vance Stole $2 million to Fund an Affair." The room went completely silent except for the sound of someone gasping. I let the slides advance automatically, each one more damning than the last. There were bank transfers from Vance Industries accounts to shell companies registered in Jessica's name. There were invoices for fake vendor services that had never been performed. There were credit card statements showing charges at hotels during hours when both Derek and Jessica were supposedly at separate business meetings. There were text messages discussing my confidential client information, showing how Jessica was feeding Derek insider knowledge about merger negotiations and competitive bids. It was all there, documented, verified, time-stamped, and completely impossible to deny or explain away. The presentation reached the slide showing Derek using Victoria's corporate card to buy Jessica expensive gifts, and I heard someone in the crowd say something about what an idiot he was to steal from his own wife. Another voice wondered how Jessica had access to confidential merger information, and I watched as several people I recognized from my professional network made the connection and started taking out their phones, probably texting their colleagues about what they were witnessing. This was better than I'd hoped. The story was spreading in real time, being documented and shared, becoming part of the permanent record that would follow both Derek and Jessica for the rest of their careers. Derek tried one more desperate move, shouting that the documents were fabricated, that I'd created false evidence because I was jealous and wanted to destroy him. It was weak and everyone knew it, but I decided to address it anyway because I wanted no ambiguity about what had happened here. I walked up to the microphone at the podium and the room fell silent. I explained that every document in the presentation had been verified by forensic accountants, that law enforcement had been provided with the originals, and that both Derek and Jessica would have ample opportunity to dispute the evidence in court when they were charged with embezzlement, theft of trade secrets, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I told the room that I was Grant Stone, that the woman Derek had been sleeping with and using as his accomplice in corporate espionage was my wife Jessica, and that I'd spent the last 3 weeks building an airtight case that would probably send them both to federal prison for 5 to 10 years. I explained that I was sharing this information publicly, not because I enjoyed humiliating people, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in it, but because I believed the business community deserved to know when they were dealing with criminals who would steal proprietary information and sell it to competitors. I thanked Victoria for her partnership in this investigation and announced that I'd be providing expert testimony in the criminal proceedings. Then I looked directly at Jessica, who was now sobbing and trying to hide behind Derek, and I delivered the final blow. I told her that our marriage was over, that I'd already filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order, preventing her from accessing any of my assets or property, and that she would be receiving an eviction notice for our apartment since it was owned by my family trust, and she had no legal claim to it. I mentioned that I'd also filed a civil lawsuit for damages related to the theft of confidential information, seeking compensation for the business losses caused by her actions. I said all of this in the same calm, professional tone I'd used to present quarterly earnings, watching her face crumble. At each sentence landed like a precision strike. Security finally escorted Derek out, practically dragging him as he shouted increasingly incoherent protests and threats. Jessica tried to follow, but I held up the restraining order paperwork I'd brought with me, reminding her that she was required to maintain a distance of at least 500 feet from me at all times. She stood there in the middle of the ballroom in her expensive red dress, mascara running down her face, surrounded by hundreds of people who were all staring at her with expressions ranging from disgust to pity, and I felt absolutely nothing except clinical satisfaction that the operation had gone according to plan. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, maybe apologize or explain or beg, but no words came out, and eventually she just turned and ran from the room. The rest of the evening took on a surreal quality. Victoria gave a brief speech explaining that Vance Industries had discovered financial irregularities in recent months, that appropriate action had been taken, and that the company would be implementing new oversight procedures to prevent future incidents. She thanked the attendees for their understanding and support, pivoted smoothly to discussing the charity being honored that night, and somehow managed to salvage the event's stated purpose while also making it clear that her company was under new management and anyone doing business with them should expect higher standards going forward. It was a masterclass in crisis management, and I found myself genuinely impressed by her composure. Several people approached me afterward, some offering sympathy, others wanting to know more details about the case. A few clearly trying to assess whether their own business relationships might be compromised. I handled each conversation professionally, providing enough information to satisfy curiosity without compromising the legal proceedings, and making it clear that this was an isolated incident involving two individuals rather than a broader pattern of problems in my firm or network. By the time the evening ended, I'd actually strengthened several business relationships and received 2 new client inquiries from executives who were impressed by how thoroughly I documented everything. The media coverage the next day was extensive and brutal. Every major business publication ran stories about the scandal, most using headlines like CEO caught stealing millions to fund affair and corporate espionage uncovered at Vance Industries charity gala. Jessica's name appeared in every article, identified as the accomplice who'd provided confidential information from her husband's firm. Her LinkedIn profile was flooded with angry messages and mock recommendations. Her employer terminated her by noon, citing violation of ethics policies and potential legal liability. Derek was arrested by federal agents before the end of the business day, charged with wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Jessica wasn't arrested immediately, but my attorneys assured me that charges were forthcoming once prosecutors finished reviewing the evidence. I went to the office the next day like it was any other Tuesday, though I noticed people treating me differently, with a combination of respect and wariness that comes from watching someone methodically destroy their enemies. My partners called an emergency meeting where they expressed concern about the publicity and potential impact on client relationships, but I presented them with the same documentation I'd shown the public, demonstrating that I'd been the victim rather than the perpetrator, and that I'd handled the situation in the most professional way possible given the circumstances. By the end of the meeting, they were congratulating me on protecting the firm's intellectual property and discussing whether we should pursue additional civil remedies. The legal proceedings unfolded exactly as predicted. Derek pleaded guilty to embezzlement in exchange for a reduced sentence of 7 years in federal prison and full restitution to Vance Industries. Though since he had no assets left after Victoria's divorce attorneys finished with him, the restitution was largely symbolic. Jessica fought the charges initially, hiring a criminal defense attorney with money borrowed from her parents. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her attorney eventually advised her to accept a plea deal. She received 4 years for conspiracy and theft of trade secrets, with provisions allowing early release for good behavior, but the federal conviction meant her career in corporate marketing was finished forever. Victoria proceeded with her divorce using grounds of fraud and infidelity, which in New York meant Derek received nothing in the settlement except his personal clothing and a 13-year-old sedan she'd been generous enough to let him keep. She restructured Vance Industries, bringing in new executives and implementing financial controls that would make future embezzlement nearly impossible. And the company's stock actually increased after the scandal because investors appreciated her transparency and swift action. She sent me a bottle of extremely expensive whiskey with a note thanking me for the partnership and suggesting we grab lunch sometime to discuss potential business opportunities. My divorce from Jessica was finalized within 6 months since she didn't contest anything, and I'd already divided the assets in a way that left her nothing to fight over. The apartment, the investment accounts, the vacation property proceeds, everything went to me or into trusts she couldn't touch. She asked through her attorney if we could meet to talk, maybe work out some kind of financial support arrangement since she was going to prison and had no resources. But I declined. I instructed my attorney to remind her that she'd made choices knowing the potential consequences, that she'd committed crimes for which she was being punished, and that I felt no obligation to ease the burden of consequences she'd brought upon herself. 3 months after the gala, after the initial media frenzy had died down and the legal proceedings were moving through the system, I was working late at my new office with a view of Central Park when Victoria called. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in serving as a consultant for Vance Industries, helping her implement the financial oversight systems we had discussed. The contract she proposed was generous, and I accepted, not because I needed the money, but because I discovered that Victoria and I worked well together. We understood each other's approach to business and life, appreciated efficiency and precision, and had no patience for emotional messiness or unnecessary drama. Our professional relationship eventually evolved into something more personal, though neither of us was in any hurry to remarry or declare romantic feelings. We had dinner occasionally, attended industry events together, discussed strategy and business philosophy during long evenings at her penthouse or my condo. It was comfortable and uncomplicated, based on mutual respect and shared values rather than passion or need. She told me once that she appreciated my directness, that most men were either intimidated by her wealth and power or trying to exploit it, but I treated her like an equal partner, which was refreshing. I told her the feeling was mutual. I thought about Jessica sometimes, usually when I received updates from my attorneys about the progress of her criminal case. I wondered if she ever grasped the full extent of what she'd lost, whether she understood that the issue wasn't just the affair, but the betrayal of trust and theft of proprietary information that I'd worked years to develop. I wondered if Derek had explained to her that his grand promises of leaving Victoria and building a life together had been lies he told to manipulate her into being his accomplice. Mostly, though, I wondered if either of them had learned anything from the experience, or if they were just bitter people blaming everyone except themselves for the consequences of their actions. The message Jessica left on my office voicemail about a month before her scheduled prison surrender answered that question. She was crying, saying she'd made terrible mistakes, but I'd destroyed her life unnecessarily, that I could have just divorced her quietly instead of making it a public spectacle and getting her charged with crimes. She said I was cruel and vindictive, that I'd taken revenge too far, that I should have shown some compassion and understanding given the years we'd spent together. She actually expected me to feel guilty, to second-guess my choices, to wonder if I'd been too harsh. I deleted the message without finishing it and blocked her number permanently. But Jessica wasn't done trying to reach me. 2 weeks later, my assistant informed me that a woman matching Jessica's description had tried to enter our building lobby without an appointment, claiming she needed to speak with me urgently about a personal matter. Security had turned her away, but she'd waited outside for 3 hours before finally leaving. The next day, she showed up at a restaurant where I was having lunch with a potential client, approaching our table with mascara-stained cheeks and trembling hands. Before the maitre d' intercepted her, she told him she was my wife and needed 5 minutes of my time, that it was an emergency, that she was desperate. I watched through the window as they escorted her outside, watched her collapse onto a bench across the street, her body shaking with sobs that I could see but not hear. My client asked if I wanted to reschedule, clearly uncomfortable with the drama unfolding, but I assured him everything was under control and suggested we order the Dover sole. Later that evening, my attorney called to inform me that Jessica's parents had contacted him, begging me to show some mercy, to drop the civil lawsuit, to consider that their daughter was already going to prison and didn't need additional financial ruin. They offered to pay restitution for the damages I'd claimed if I would just agree to leave her alone. I listened to the message while Victoria and I shared wine in her penthouse, and when it finished, I looked at her and asked if she thought I was being unreasonable. She considered the question for maybe 10 seconds before telling me that compassion for people who show no remorse is just weakness dressed up as virtue. The following week, Jessica showed up at Victoria's corporate headquarters, somehow talking her way past the front desk by claiming she had information about ongoing criminal activity at Vance Industries. Security brought her to a conference room where Victoria happened to be in a meeting, and I received a call asking if I wanted to be present for what was likely to be an interesting conversation. I arrived to find Jessica looking like she'd aged 10 years in 3 months, her designer clothes replaced with cheap separates that hung loosely on a frame that had lost at least 20 pounds. She sat across from Victoria and me, flanked by 2 security guards, and launched into what could only be described as a desperate attempt at negotiation mixed with emotional blackmail. She told us that we'd misunderstood everything, that she'd been manipulated by Derek, who'd promised to leave Victoria and marry her, that she'd only provided him with information because he'd convinced her it was necessary to help his company compete fairly. She claimed that the affair had been Derek's idea from the beginning, that he'd seduced her at an industry conference, and then gradually convinced her that helping him was the right thing to do. She said she'd been stupid and naive, that she'd believed his lies about loving her and building a future together, and that we were punishing her for being a victim rather than a criminal. It was a masterful performance, complete with tears and trembling voice, and it might have been effective if I didn't have recordings of her laughing about how easy it was to steal my files and how much she enjoyed spending my money while sleeping with someone else. Victoria let her finish the entire speech before calmly pulling out her own tablet and playing a video file. It was security footage from the Vance Industries parking garage, showing Derek and Jessica in his car 6 months ago, and the audio was crystal clear. Jessica wasn't being manipulated or coerced. She was actively planning how to extract more information from my files, discussing which of my clients would be most vulnerable to losing contracts, and joking about how oblivious I was to what was happening under my own roof. The footage showed her initiating physical contact with Derek, laughing at his jokes about me being too focused on numbers to notice a woman's needs, and suggesting they celebrate their latest successful information theft at the Plaza Hotel. It was devastating evidence that destroyed any claim of victimhood or manipulation. Jessica's face went white as she watched herself on screen, and whatever negotiating position she'd hoped to establish evaporated instantly. Victoria informed her that this footage, along with hours of similar material, had already been provided to prosecutors and would be used at trial to demonstrate her active participation and enthusiasm for the criminal enterprise. I added that her parents' offer of restitution was insufficient given that my actual damages exceeded $3 million when accounting for lost contracts and damaged business relationships, and that I would be pursuing full collection regardless of her prison sentence. Security escorted her out while she screamed obscenities about what horrible people we were, how we destroyed her life over a mistake, how karma would catch up with us eventually. The guards had to physically carry her to the elevator as she continued shouting threats and accusations that echoed through the marble lobby. People asked me sometimes if I regretted how I'd handled everything, if I wished I'd been less thorough or more forgiving. The answer was always no. Jessica and Derek hadn't just betrayed their spouses. They'd committed crimes that hurt real people and companies. They'd stolen money, traded in confidential information, and done it all with complete disregard for anyone except themselves. The fact that their punishment was severe didn't make it unjust. It made it appropriate. I'd simply ensured that the legal system and public opinion had access to the full truth, and that both of them faced consequences proportional to their actions. I stood in my office one evening about 6 months after the gala, looking out at the city lights while sipping Victoria's expensive whiskey, and took stock of my life. I was financially secure, professionally respected, and legally free from a marriage that had been dead long before I discovered it was also criminal. I'd built new business relationships, strengthened existing ones, and earned a reputation as someone who could handle crisis situations with uncommon precision and efficiency. My firm had actually benefited from the publicity because clients wanted someone who would protect their interests that zealously. Most importantly, I'd learned a valuable lesson about the difference between emotional reactions and strategic responses. A lesser man might have confronted Jessica the moment he discovered her betrayal, thrown her belongings into the street, maybe even gotten physical in a moment of rage. That approach would have felt satisfying for maybe 5 minutes, and then I'd have spent years dealing with messy divorce proceedings, contested asset divisions, and he said, she said arguments about who did what and when. Instead, I treated the situation like a business problem requiring a business solution. And I'd executed that solution with the same methodical care I'd bring to any complex acquisition or restructuring. The final legal documents arrived in early spring, confirming that both Derek and Jessica had begun serving their prison sentences and that all civil matters had been resolved in my favor. I filed the paperwork in a folder labeled Closed Accounts and put it in my desk drawer. That chapter of my life was finished, documented, archived, and no longer requiring any attention or emotional energy. I had new projects to work on, new challenges to tackle, and a future that looked significantly brighter than it would have if I'd stayed married to a woman who saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of money and information. Victoria and I met for dinner that night at a restaurant where we'd become regulars, and over excellent wine and perfectly prepared steaks, we discussed the latest developments in advanced industries and some potential partnership opportunities she wanted to explore. The conversation was intelligent and engaging, focused on strategy and execution rather than feelings and vulnerability. When we finished eating, she asked if I wanted to come back to her place to review some documents, and I agreed, knowing that the documents were real, but also understanding that we'd probably end up talking about other things too. Walking out of the restaurant into the cool spring evening, I realized that I felt genuinely content for the first time in years. Not happy in some ecstatic emotional sense, but satisfied with the direction my life was heading and confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges came next. The cost of that contentment had been a marriage that was probably doomed from the beginning, but the ROI was a life organized around my priorities and values rather than someone else's agenda. In the cold calculus, I used to make sense of the world. That was an excellent trade.